Jonathan, when you visited me there in the hospital and gave me what I perceive now to be one of the most beneficial pieces of wisdom I have ever heard, that salvation is a process, I had been delving into the inner sanctum of my mind through a personal journal I had begun. I never felt that I could know the truth. I was always confused about it. But when I started writing down spiritual dilemmas I had, I started receiving answers from somewhere. I didn't know where the answers were coming from, and I thought to myself that there was such wisdom in what I was writing that perhaps I had tapped into some sort of divine source. I thought to myself, I rarely, if ever, have original ideas, and yet here on this page before me were answers to questions I'd had for years. And it seems like the more I probed into the inner recesses of my mind, the more answers I found to the problems that were troubling me. Like why I never had confidence, why I always felt I would fail at things, why my life seemed to lack direction. These were questions that I felt the Bible had failed to answer for me to a large degree, and so, in a sense, my journal became more important to me than the Bible. I felt I had attained the truth, and that I had reached a sort of enlightenment. This was not a pain-free process, however. I experienced extreme fear at certain times and extreme elation at others. I became extremely fearful when I began treading on dangerous ground by starting to entertain such notions that Christ was not the Son of God, and also feeling at other times that I had killed the God in the box, the God that I had been depending on my whole life to fill my needs. I started to realize that my view of God had been extremely limited, and that I had depended on God for everything in my life. Everything. I had always prayed to God for confidence and never received it. I had always prayed for love, yet I always felt selfish. I was learning that if I wanted to change something about myself, I had to be the one to make the change, and could no longer rely on God to do it for me. This was extremely liberating for me, but at the same time brought incredible fears, because in my mind's eye I saw myself as eventually attaining such a level of confidence that I could command the entire world's attention. I began to feel there would come a time in my life when the entire world would look to me for instruction and direction, and I realized during these moments of awe and wonder that I could easily abuse that power. I literally felt as though I had flipped a switch in my head that would give me such boldness and lack of fear, yet I was terrified that when I had attained all that power, I might fall victim to my own evil. At times I was terrified that I might be the Antichrist, and that once I had gained the world's attention, I might force people to worship me. I wasn't so deluded at this time that I thought I had completely overcome evil within me, and so this fear persisted that once given dominion, I might abuse my power. Over time, I began to forget about my evil, and pretty much convinced myself that I was a good person. And if I ever did command the attention of the world, I would use my power for good. This came into play more and more as I delved into my journal world and explored mysterious realities of my mind. Over time, though, a theme continued repeating itself over and over and over. I talked more and more about love and uniting the world together, and I felt the haters would think evil things about me. But I became more and more convinced in my heart of hearts that I was actually the Messiah. I felt that I would lead the world to God. At the beginning of this, I viewed Christ sort of as a brother. But time went on, and I began to play some dangerous mental games. I don't exactly know what brought it about, but after time, I began what started out as a thought experiment. I was tired of viewing people through Christ's eyes, and I thought it might be interesting to consider another perspective. It always seemed to me, I thought, that we think evil of what Christ calls evil, and we always align ourselves with his statements about good and evil. But what if I considered the Pharisees' perspective, I thought? I began to work my way through the Gospels, and every time Christ would condemn the Pharisees, call them pigs, snakes, mock their charity, mock their missionary work, mock their sacrifices, I put myself in the Pharisees' place. I imagined myself as following the Mosaic law to the best of my ability, paying close attention to details, following the traditions of my loved and cherished ones, and I did a dangerous thing, which eventually brought me to such a pit of despair that there are no words to describe the suffering. I imagined the Pharisees to be decent, caring people. People who loved their families, people who were doing the best they could, trying to fulfill a law that was very demanding. I thought these people want to please God just like everyone else. These people have hopes, fears, and dreams. They have been taught a certain way all their lives, and now that Christ shows up on the scene, he expects them to give up their traditions and their ways of life because of him. I began to understand more and more why Christ was crucified. I thought to myself, judgment is reciprocal. Christ attacked the Pharisees, and the Pharisees returned attack in kind. Christ judged the Pharisees as sons of Satan, and the Pharisees judged Christ as demon-possessed. He could have commended them on their attempts at charity and encouraged them to be less flashy and not worry so much whether other men saw them giving. He could have commended them for fasting and instructed them that it would be better for them to be clean-shaven so as not to try and draw praise from men. In other words, I wanted Christ to be kind and encouraging, the way Billy Graham is, or Joel Osteen is. I thought to myself, if Christ came today and started yelling and judging rich people like rappers and movie stars and Donald Trump, they would all judge him back and say that he's insensitive and extremely rude because that is our gut reaction when we are being judged. In a similar fashion, the Pharisees hated being judged. And as I was associating with them at that time, I felt judged as well. It was at that moment that I began descending into hell. I analyzed nearly everything in the Gospels from the viewpoint that Christ was a hypocrite, because he said, "Do not judge," and yet he was standing in condemnation of so many people. A Christian man named Barrett at my workplace, Alert Cellular, argued with me and pleaded with me to accept the truth that Christ was perfect. Therefore, he had the right and the power to judge. But I would have none of it. I would rebut, "Barrett, wouldn't you say it is a sin to swear? Well, don't you think that calling someone a viper or a dog or a snake or a son of Satan is just as sinful as calling someone a shithead?" Christ's words were just as destructive, if not more so, than swear words we use today. Furthermore, I was convinced that making mistakes is the only way to know morally right from wrong. I thought if Christ was fully human, he had to learn the difference between right and wrong from his parents, just like every child does. The only way a child can learn that something he has done is wrong is to be chastised or disciplined when he has done something naughty. Therefore, if Christ was fully human, he had to commit sin and be disciplined because of it in order to learn that sin was wrong. I was perfectly convinced of my rationale, as illogical as it was. I was so certain I was right about Christ's sinfulness. Eventually, I took my reasoning to its logical, inevitable conclusion. If Christ is sinful, and I am opposed to all sin, which I believe myself to be, I must be the Antichrist. And since I am perfect, which I also believed at that time, Christ must be the worst of all sinners, because he is diametrically opposed to me. Ultimately, I became convinced that Christ was suffering terribly in hell, and I was the chosen one. What irony, I thought. The Bible is like a giant riddle. It tells us that Christ is good, and the Antichrist is evil, when in fact the Antichrist is good, and Christ is evil. I felt like God had revealed the riddle of the Bible to me, and now it was my duty to share my knowledge with the world. As I left my post at Alert Cellular, ready to transform the world, after confessing my ultimate conclusion that I must be the Antichrist, the last words I heard from Barrett were, "I'll be praying for you." I thank God for Barrett. Everything went downhill from there. I'll continue this in the next video.